during lockdown.
Record.
Let me know if you want my broadband. I can sell it to you at a footing.
Recording in progress. Much for coming. Recording in progress. Good evening and welcome to St George's Talks, a monthly lecture series live from a historic German church in London's East End. My name is Rick Jones and I'm the committee member looking after secular events which happen here. Talks and concerts mainly. During lockdown, we went virtual and now present the talks to both a real audience here at St George's, and welcome everybody who's here, and a virtual one at home in their pajamas. Themes reflect the history of St George's, which was once the hub of a community of German 18th century migrant workers who raised funds in 1763 to build this place. Its hard pews, its galleries and wheezy organ. This talk is the 25th since we began to Zoom last year. Our guest this evening is the German-speaking Member of Parliament for Exeter, where he'd once been a journalist. He'd studied Germanistic, German culture as a local radio reporter, and in 1989 took over in Berlin because the correspondent there had quit for want of anything or something to happen to report. He covered the resumption of Berlin as capital of reunited Deutschland, and for several years his stories charmed the lunchtime listeners to The World at One. He entered Parliament with Labour's win in 1997 and was at the Foreign Office when the terrorist attacks of 9/11 changed the world. One would say he has very good timing. He served as Minister of State for the Environment, for Health, and latterly for Culture, Media and Sport in that first decade of the new millennium. He is a member of the Privy Council and should be addressed in certain terms. So will you welcome, please, our guest tonight, the MP, the Right Honourable Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Rick, for that very comprehensive and kind introduction. I feel like say how delighted I am to be existed, which is such a fantastic piece of history. Maybe finding a few more refugees from the Anglican Church, maybe Anglican Church is going at the moment
to
18th century
being based in one
migration
of Europe's great cities, reporting on the country, in my case, East Germany and Berlin, for the BBC. But I think the reason he made this suggestion, and I wasn't aware of this at the time, was that in those days, and indeed for most of the post-war history, the BBC maintained a correspondent in Berlin whose primary role was to broadcast in German to communist East Germany and actually further afield to the rest of Germany too. Rather in a similar way that the BBC had foreign language services across most of the communist world, and still does in those parts of the world where we feel those people could benefit from a free and democratic media. And although I thought that it was a bit of a long shot, I did apply, and rather to my surprise, was invited for an interview, and even more to my surprise,
telephoned on the evening of the interview. It was the first ever time I've been to Bush House. But I got the job. I got the job.
on
This was
the
quite a shock.
evening of the
At such a
interview.
young age, and it's so
First ever time I've been to Bush House.
into
The interview by the head of
and this seems to be a genuine reformer. And although this might not happen in my time, it does seem that change is afoot in the communist countries of East Germany. And who knows?
why on earth I wanted to go and work in Berlin, where it's said nothing had really happened since the wall went up. My predecessor had stepped back in boredom, because he wasn't getting very much on the news. And I said, well, there is this chap called Gorbachev who seems to be shaking things up a bit in Eastern Europe, and seems to be a genuine reformer. And although this might not happen in my time, it does seem that change is afoot in the communist countries of East Germany. And who knows, if I'm lucky, this might happen rather sooner than any of us expect. So anyway, off I trundle with my then partner, who was German, and a furniture maker who was rather reluctant to go back to Germany, having settled and set up a career for himself perfectly happily here. And I found myself in this very large house in the Grune
freely without needing to open my car, without needing to tell these German border cards and checkpoint Charlie what I was doing. And I could do so on the whim. I didn't have to apply, as most other Western journalists did at the time, for permission to even visit Germany, let alone to do any journalism there. As events began to unfold, how valuable this past was. It also had
those were the days, of course, of continued IRA activity, and I was advised after a few months there that I should give the military numbers under threat Grunewald, and I think anyone who wanted to bother to find out could probably work out what my official status was.
almost as soon as I arrived at the beginning of 1989, it was clear that things were afoot. And indeed, one of the first things I did, apart from making contacts with those of my predecessors who had built up a good network of contacts in East Berlin, Mark Brain, is a name that may mean something to some of you, was
one of my very commendable predecessors, who'd actually been based in East Berlin as a Reuters working for the BBC in the Royal and as a Reuters correspondent living in East Berlin, he had joined the Dome Corps in East Berlin and had met a lot of close friends through those contacts. One of whom, or a family of whom, were the Hildebrands, Regina Hildebrandt, she was called. Again, a name that some of you might recognise from the vendor and from reunification. She ended up becoming a very senior figure in the SDP, and at one stage was touted as a potential leader before she very sadly died at too young an age from cancer. Her husband is still alive, and I'm still in touch with her. But
this was my first insight, really, into the important role that the Lutheran Church in East Germany was playing, had been playing, and would continue to play in the East German resistance and opposition, and eventually in the overthrow of the communist regime. One of the first events I covered in East Germany, for which I did have to apply for a permit to go and cover, was the Leipzig Kirchentag in the July of 1989. And I applied to go to this because Germans travelling from all over the country, informally, formally, to really get a feel for what's going on and how people are thinking about events, not just in East Germany. Talking to people informally, there was even an unofficial and unpermitted demonstration for democracy that became the beginnings, if you like, of those regular Monday demonstrations that they held first in Leipzig, but then spread of 1989. Other things going on at the time, you may remember, were the significant milestones, and there were so many, I won't go through them all, but when Hungary opened its borders for the BBC at the time, saying it's very difficult to imagine now how the East Germans and the rest of the communist bloc can maintain their borders and keep their people in, when East Germans can still travel to Hungary and then just go out through what is now an open border into West Germany. We had the phenomenon of East Germans occupying Eastern Europe in a bid to get to the West, even occupying the Ständige Vertretung in East Berlin to do the same. There was then the historic visit during the almost 40th anniversary celebrations of the GDR in the October of 1989, where President Gorbachev and many world leaders came to join in those commemorations, where Gorbachev was asked, and I believe the question was put by my BBC colleague Bridget Shaw in this visit, was asked by Bridget Kendall in Russian what he thought of the position of the German regime. Wer zu spät kommt, dem bestraft das Leben. He who comes late will be by circumstances. Interpreting quite in the East regime to any sort of form, they were at the time one resistant to later in that, all of you as well call this, when by surprise one of the leaders of and following Gorbachev's convention, there had been a meeting of the Central Committee of the SAD, the Communists, asked what had been did, and one of the things he said had been decided liberation rules for East Germans. And one of the journalists asked him exactly what he meant, and this would start. which he clearly didn't know the answer to that, and it hadn't been decided. He looked around at his colleagues and he blurted out, "Up so fort," and this was the moment where East Germans who've been following this news live, but it isn't particularly took his words at face value and hurried to the wall. The situation became, as we now know from reporting and the history book, that the Eastern Border Guard just took a spontaneous decision to let people through the night the wall came down, sort of finally, and in the most dramatic sense, and in a very dramatic and emotional way. The irony of that historic event is that I missed it. Because I had got to Berlin and had basically not stopped working since I arrived, and as the pace of events I thought to myself, I really need to take a break now, because this story is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if I don't take a bit of a break now, I'm in danger of burnout. So at that particular week, I decided to come back to my home in Devon and spend a few days walking on Dartmoor. But I was back on a plane to Berlin the next day and joining everyone else on the wall dancing. And later, when I returned home to our home in Berlin, I found a little huddle of friends of ours from East Germany and East Berlin, people I'd known for years and who I never expected to be able to host in my own home. And this, for me, was the abiding and the most emotional moment of that time. Something which I had never, as I say, really dared to hope or imagine might happening so quickly. And as I say, the rest is history. There were many. That wasn't the end of the story, and there could have been. When the largely peaceful transition could have gone very badly wrong, moments when the Russians made very clear to the East Germans not to use violence, when senior artists and musicians intervened, interventions from the church, from people like Manfred Stolper, who was sort of the official head of the Lutheran Church in East Germany and did all the liaising between the regime and the church. Not an ambivalent figure, because it later emerged that he had also acted as an informer to the Stasi. I think it's very difficult sometimes to make judgments on people who lived under that regime for so long and how they behaved as individuals. If they thought there was a more important goal in sight, and he also went on to become a successful politician in the reunified Germany, being the first Democratic Minister President of Brandenburg, undefeated and the most popular politician in Germany when he also died rather young. I just wanted to add a couple more things about the role of the church and the Lutheran Church and faith in this whole matter. I've already touched on the importance that that the churches and the church people, if only to provide a relatively safe space, and the spaces weren't often completely safe, but they were relatively safe. And a lot of the figures who emerged from nowhere once this momentum to form political groups, pro-democracy groups. Many of those came from like Jens Reich, people like Rainer Eppermann, who immediately after the wall came down. The group that, incidentally, Angela, it's interesting. I had dealings. She gave absolutely no indication to end up being what she became. And in fact, you know, she was rather, Demokratischer Aufbruch was one of those groups that East German front parties, as they were called, would cover. It wasn't one of the genuine sort of survived that, and as we know, went on to great Ukraine crisis, is perhaps not quite as many of those people, I think, had found the space, and of course she was a pastor's the child of a pastor like me in their lives, to develop ideas and find the solidarity and the courage to do the right thing. The votes in the south and the west reflected perhaps a little skepticism about Berlin, very old, comfortable and cozy with our little, you know, the Catholic Rhineland. I don't know. I've never seen any definitive research on that, but it is something that I wondered might have played a role in that very knife edge. And those of you who've been back to Berlin recently or since, what a job! What a job Germany has done over the last decades with still notwithstanding the huge challenges that still exist in some of the East. But when I read in the Financial Times recently that the lender in East Germany are now richer and have a higher pro capita wealth and income than many of the poorest regions in the United Kingdom, one does wonder what on earth we've been doing here. And look in admiration at how the Germans have pulled together and done this, and now playing what I always hoped would be their role as the leading democracy and advocate of democratic, decent, humane values in our modern Europe. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was you've given us a very evocative picture of Berlin in 1989 and the split that came and the
attitude towards Berlin.
recreation of Berlin as once again the capital of Germany. What about in Berlin itself, the east and west, the cultural differences within the city? That must have been quite a difficult match for people to come to terms with. Suddenly, the war no longer there, and neighbours across the border were now going to the same shops. I mean, maybe you could say something a little bit about that, the atmosphere in Berlin at the time.
Yes, I mean, in the immediate sort of 48 hours after the wall opened, initially, it then reclosed again, of course. There was some managed process over it. I mean, I remember doing several reports from bars and nightclubs in West Berlin, full of East Germans coming to experience for the first time West Berlin's famous nightlife. I didn't, because the subject didn't interest me, but there were reports at the time also of anymore pawn shops or sex shops in West Berlin being inundated with these. I think that, of course, there was a natural desire very quickly to try to experience and some of the things that had not been available to you if you hadn't been one of those privileged people who'd ever been able to travel to the west. And there was incredible euphoria at the time. I think we all kind of felt that the process would bring with it huge challenges. And there was a sense, and there still is a sense among many East Germans that some of the positive things about life in East Germany, which because they didn't have such a lot of entertainment and the kind of things that sort of we take for granted here, they found pleasure in simpler things, and they also in some ways valued personal relationships and spending time with friends and family more than our sort of fast-moving and materialistic Western culture had. I think there was a sense of that sort of being lost, but you very rarely meet, and you didn't then, you very rarely do, unless they happen to have been a higher communist who lost all their privileges. You very rarely meet, particularly young people now, who want to go back. But there is still a big wealth and salary gap. Most of the big political leadership jobs and industrial jobs in the East are still held by Westerners. But that will come, that will change, and that is changing. It was always going to take an extremely long time to change. But I think, given the challenges, I think the managing that process without serious sort of social dislocation and unrest is a pretty fantastic achievement. Yes, there's been the rise of the AfD in the East, and there are still things in the attitudes in the East that have not quite been processed through. They never had, the East Germans never had property Nazification in the same way that the West Germans did, because they were told that they were victims of the Nazis, and communism was now their saviour. So it's a bit like parallels here with Austria, but in a different way. So there are differences still, but I'm confident that these regions will prosper and will continue to. And it's I think the challenges have generally been met extremely well.
You said that there are a few people who would wish to go back now. You mean back in time?
I don't think there are many people who honestly want to go back to Germany and the Berlin Wall. I think there are people who miss aspects of East German life and as it was. But I don't think most of those, even those who do, and there've been quite a lot of there've been books, and there's been some rather good theatre and film about this as well. Ostnostalgie, as it's called.
Yeah.
But even those people who have a sense of nostalgia, nostalgie, don't want to go back to normal. They are pleased that they are now in a democracy.
Yeah.
And in spite of it, I think it's also a generational thing. Obviously, people who lost their jobs at the time of the vendor and never worked again, that's tough. I mean, that was very tough for them and tough for their families. But most of those people, I know their children are doing fine, and their children will hopefully do even better.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the floor this evening? Yes, Sigrid.
Just a comment on, I'm fairly sure that your analysis of the Protestant side wanting Berlin and the Western and Southern Catholic side wanting Bonn, there's probably a big thing in it, because we only got Bonn because the Catholic Cologne Adenauer wanted it to be where he felt comfortable and not anywhere where he wasn't feeling comfortable. And even today in Bavaria, the rest of Germany has a nickname, Prussia. I think your analysis has quite a bit of a point to it.
I tried to do a bit of research on this actually when I reminded myself of the geographical split, but I couldn't. I'm sure someone's written about it, but I couldn't find any academic analysis of it. But it would be interesting to see it.
Just another point, another comment. When the discussion happened about to leave Bonn or take Berlin, I remember it quite well, and the aspects that I was told were quite different and had nothing to do with religion, but more from my economic background. I've visited all the buildings in place, and Berlin, nothing against East Germany, but Berlin, even nowadays, isn't exactly the capital of business Germany. You get that in Düsseldorf, Munich, you get that somewhere totally different. And Berlin financially was struggling anyway, and that was the main argument that I remember from those days.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And don't forget, of course, a lot of the ministries and a lot of international organisations were left in Bonn, and I think some are still there. But no, you're absolutely right. And I thought not only the moral argument, but the economy, but also in East Berlin, East Germans being part of this. And if you can imagine if they'd gone to Bonn, how that would have made the East Germans feel even more as if this was a takeover and it wasn't something involving them. So yeah, and it's all the fears that were expressed by some about resurgent the imperial capital Berlin, all the historical connotations. I don't really feel they had really very much merit. But it was, as I say, it was very close, and it divided parties, it divided generations, and it was I thought was one of the more interesting debates of the whole process. And I have to say personally, I was delighted when the vote went the way it did.
This is a bit primary school, but I brought along with me my piece of the Berlin Wall. So here it is. My husband went to work after the wall came down in Halle, near Leipzig. He was helping an architectural firm who wanted to had no experience of this. And he felt the conflict. They wanted to join in the West, but they rather resented that they were so far behind that, so he was doing his best to help them, but they didn't really want him there in a way. It was sort of, we ought to be able to do this ourselves. So there was that conflict.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I in a way, I think it was I mean, it was unavoidable because there weren't really the East German politicians who were ready to take on some of those leadership jobs. I mean, Manfred Stolpe and Regina Hildebrandt were exceptions. I think most of the other prime ministers of the East German Länder after unification were from the West. I mean, Kurt Biedenkopf being the famous example in Saxony. I thought he was a very successful, and he was a very popular prime minister of Saxony, although he was a West German import. And he is the person I credit with a tremendous economic upswing in Saxony that was much quicker and more better managed, I would argue, than it was in a lot of the other Eastern Länder. But no, you're absolutely right. I incidentally have not got any pieces of the wall because I gave them away. Come over and stay, and they said, "Oh, I can have a piece of the wall." So I ended up years later buying one of those horrible things that's mounted on a plastic stand. I don't even. I have that on my. If you haven't been to Berlin recently or haven't been to Berlin at all since all of this happened, and do go, please go to the Bernauer Strasse Open Air Museum, where they've actually retained quite a long piece of the wall and have done some very good interpretation of what it was. Because it's very difficult for people now who weren't born or didn't know to imagine what it was like. You know, you had quite narrow streets, not much wider than this church, with houses on opposite sides, but with a wall going down the middle and death strips either side. It really is. The Bernauer one's particularly poignant because it separates. I think it separates the church from its graveyard. It's right up against one of those wonderful sort of Gründerzeit red brick churches, or where the church was. I think the in the death strip, with the graveyard still there, across through the Brandenburg Tor or down Friedrichstrasse and Friedrichstrasse, where the East Germans, where you left tearful goodbyes from East German friends before the war came down there. I don't know emotions ever going to leave me, to be honest.
No. I can understand that. You must have gone out in search of your own stories for the BBC. Are there any that particularly you remember now? Personal stories, people being reunited after 50 years?
Yes. Do you know some of the things that I found most interesting were some of the more quirky things. There was one extraordinary story which I think again sort of took everybody by surprise, and maybe it's because I was naive and we were naive. Do you remember suddenly it was discovered that quite a lot of the RAF terrorists, the West German Baader-Meinhof gang, who had disappeared and nobody knew where they were, had been living in East Germany under the protection of the communist regime, working as plumbers and carpenters and or even teachers. And this was one of the more astonishing, because I'd always read the suggestions that the East German regime had been actively supporting that violent terrorist campaign, but I never thought they could be quite that venal. And indeed they had. And then when these people had fled, they had fled to East Germany. The other thing that was extraordinary, remember the role that was played by the I can't remember the name of the guy, who there was basically a system whereby the West German government would buy people out of East Germany, and it was all hush-hush, nobody ever talked about it formally. It was run by a guy whose name I've forgotten. Huge sums of money were involved. And this was never publicly known. In West Germany, which was a democracy either, I thought that was really weird. Lots of stories about restitution of property, because of course, although in Germany and in West Berlin, people, and Jewish people in particular, had had, to a good extent, compensation and restitution of property. I knew very well an East German radio called Thomas Silberstein, whose name might give away was Jewish, whose father was murdered by the Nazis, carrying the only thing on his body was the full score of Tristan and Isolde, which greatly endeared me to Thomas, and we became firm friends. He suffered under the Wende, and that he was sacked from his job at East German radio. I thought rather unfairly, but there's a nice end to this story because his family had their double-fronted block of houses very close to Alexanderplatz in the middle of East Berlin restored to them, and so they need to worry about money. Won't have to worry about money ever again. So there were lovely little, sort of lovely human stories like that. The Stasi archive. I have still not, incidentally, gone to see my Stasi file. It's one of the things. It's one of the things I wanted to leave a very long time before I did, because I didn't want to find out that somebody who was or may still be dear to me had spied on me. What's the point in knowing that? I wanted to leave a very long period of time, and actually I did make an initial application right at the beginning, and they said there isn't one, which would seem to indicate to me that they either hadn't found it, or some of them had been spirited away to Moscow by the Russians, the ones they considered most sensitive. But since then, a lot more have come to light. So there probably is something, and eventually I will probably get round to it. But it wasn't always a positive experience. For example, discovered that her lifelong partner, husband, had been spying on her. It was a very, that would really be a life show. And nothing had hurt me, nothing had affected me. I hadn't come to any harm myself. So I don't really want to know who all these sort of friends I made in East Berlin who were real friends, and which of them were kind of put on to me by the Stasi. Doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned.
You could Google yourself.
Well, you could, but you have to delve quite deeply into these Akten to find anything really very substantial.
Yes. Penny.
I was going to say, what percentage of those people who were found to have been traitors were actually brought to book? You talked about the Baden Meinhof.
Yeah.
Did they ever face justice?
I think so. Yeah, I think they did. I can't recall off the top of my head, I'm afraid. And I mean, interestingly enough, I think one or two of them even recanted. One or two of them who kind of led these. Yes, but I mean, so I remember. I can't remember which one it was, but I remember being. I remember it being reported in the German media, and there were no sort of warm feelings towards these people. In mitigation that this person had spent years working as a teacher or social worker, really helping people. So no, I mean, I think I'm pretty sure they were punished, and justice did catch up with them, as it did indeed with some of the leading representatives of the regime. But there were too many informers for all of them. I mean, they did suffer in that they would have found it very difficult to find a job. But there would have been too many informers to have locked them all up. So I think that the German state had to take a sensible and proportionate view as to who was worth pursuing and who wasn't.
Yes, I was in Stuttgart recently with some friends who lived just down the road from the prison where they mostly ended up with Bader-Meinhof, but some of them, of course, ended up amongst us here, you know, the land to disappear in.
Yes.
They knew exactly where to do so.
Wasn't Gudrun Enslin in England? She ended up in England, yeah.
And then, but they, I think, all ended up in prison in Stammheim.
Yeah.
And died, I think.
Yeah. No, there was an extraordinary in West German history, and yeah. Impa.
Something else that I wanted to comment about was about the so-called Lebensborn children that came out of Norway. What happened there is that some of these people who were then living in East Germany at the time and brought up there had their identity stolen by the Stasi, and they sent other people with false identities to Norway, acting as spies for the East German regime, but with the identity of the so-called long-lost son or daughter from East Germany. I once watched a documentary about that, and it was horrendous because these poor children heavily discriminated against and had their identities stolen by the Stasi.
Yeah. So these children were actually taken into care by the East German regime?
Yes, after the Second World War, because also in Norway, the Lebensborn children were heavily discriminated against, which was also the reason why Anna Fried-Linkstad moved to Sweden with her grandmother.
I wasn't aware that this may have all been unearthed after my time. It's not something I recall.
And then I remember, would have been in the 1990s, I think it was on German TV, a documentary about the Lebensborn children who came into Germany, because not all of them stayed in Norway, and then having their identities stolen by the Stasi, which just sounded horrendous.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, it's not unprecedented today for countries' secret and intelligence services to steal people's identity so that their spies can operate. In other countries, but that does seem to be a particularly pernicious example of the practice, particularly, you know, if children are being taken into care or disappearing, to furnish those IDs.
To what extent was there a view that it was the West that was Nazified after the Second World War, which is the view that Putin and Russia, in a sense, takes now?
So what was the...
Was that a view in the East that that's what had happened after the Second World War?
No. I mean, only people who were seriously ideological and fervent in their commitment to the East German communist regime and its version of history would try to assert that kind of West Germany was somehow a continuation of Nazi Germany. I mean, you know, and you could. They did indeed, and the East German TV and propaganda regularly did reports on West Germany, pointing out how, for example, how many senior members of the judiciary in West Germany, or even some politicians in post-war West Germany, had been judges or politicians or Mitläufer of the Nazi regime. But that wasn't a sentiment, I don't think, that was held or that concerned the majority of East Germans who had access, don't forget, to West German media if they didn't live in the Dresden hole, and who knew from contacts often with West German relatives or with or people who knew West Germans that the East German official propaganda portrayal of East Germany, of West Germany by the East German regime was not accurate. I mean, there were probably a significant minority of the regime loyal people who
did believe that propaganda in the same way as there are now in Russia with Putin. But it wasn't a prevailing view. And you know, I think that
or a sense that NATO was an aggressive force intent on the Eastern Bloc.
No, I mean that's what the propaganda. I think that was something that most of the East Germans kind of thought.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say that there's not still, and we see it now in Germany today, a greater reluctance in Germany as a whole and in East Germany in particular to do more to support Ukraine with weapons and to stand fully squarely behind NATO. But I think that has more to do with the kind of general post-war German pacific approach and the consequences of history, which in some ways are understandable. A little bit of I remember attending a demonstration on Alexanderplatz after the wall came down during the Iraq. It must have been the first Gulf War, and it was a demonstration against the international coalition's action. And I remember, so I always had a BBC thing on my microphone. I remember some elderly East Germans coming up to me and saying, Engländer, Amerikaner, immer Bomben auf die Leute runterlassen, whatever the word is. And I remember thinking, that's interesting. So this man is making the parallel with the bombing of Berlin, and us and the Americans, and making the parallel now with the first Gulf War. And that was a mindset or an attitude I hadn't come across in West Germany before. It may have just been coincidental, but I think there was a little bit of that.
Yes.
But that was because they had been kind of brought up on anti-Western propaganda the whole of the post-Second World War period, and that just fed into then the anti-NATO stuff around that first Gulf War. But I don't think it was the majority or widespread. I think the demokratische Impulse from viel stärker were stronger.
Yes, we have a question from the online audience. Mr. Frank Patterson, who is a former and future speaker at this podium, says that he was in Berlin around the 40th anniversary of the DDR, which I believe was 1989?
89, October, yeah.
Quite apart from the demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, it seemed to me that wherever I went, in the streets, in the shops, everywhere there was a feeling of anticipation in the air. Did you also feel that?
Oh yes. By then, definitely. And I don't know whether. By the way, I'm glad that people have been able to see or hear some of this, because I wasn't quite sure they were. But I mean, I'm not sure whether his visit was before or after. But if it was before and after, then he would have been there when Gorbachev spoke those famous words. And I think that was a real tipping point for the mood in East Germany, because until then, the East German people had not really felt confident about how the Russians would respond to the Wende and to their demonstration and demanding democratic rights. And it was only that the Stasi and the security apparatus were pretty hopeless. I remember covering a demonstration at the Gethsemane Kirche in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin. Another, again, where the security services and the police hemmed protesters into the church. And it was one of those moments that could have got violent. It didn't. But I remember I engineered the first ever interview with Jens Reich, who was the head of Neues Forum, on the Western media, and I did so by smuggling in a TV camera and all the equipment in the boot of my car, knowing that these Germans weren't allowed to check it. And we had to get a Swiss Swiss crew to come and do the interview because they didn't need to apply for permission to go to East Berlin. They could just go over on a day visa. And we interviewed Ed right in his home on what was called a symbol rack. We pointed the camera at him and he was on the phone and putting the phone down when he was answering the questions. And this was broadcast on Newsnight that night. And the East German embassy rang the BBC the next day saying, how on earth did you get that interview? Because you didn't ask permission to do it. And I'm like, I don't care about asking permission. So, and there was no recourse. There were no consequences from that. So I think the East German security apparatus was indeed already breaking down. And that may have been something to do with the fact that the Russians had said to them, on no account, go violent on this. But the East German population, I don't think, didn't feel confident until Gorbachev uttered those words. And when Gorbachev said, you've got to reform, you've got to move, that gave them the green light. And I suspect that the comment, because it definitely changed in terms of the way that East expectations rose and anticipation, as you say, rose.
Yeah. Another question from Gabrielle Davis, more of a comment. On a school visit to East Berlin with our teachers and staying in a secret theological college, we felt they were all just fabulous and brave. And we could talk to them openly. They were fabulous. We then took part in a few talks by functionaries, and it was creepy to acknowledge the profound difference in views and attitudes towards life. They seemed so very alien. Yeah, and that sort of alternative universe, I remember that attitude as well.
Yeah. No, it's amazing, isn't it? And we're seeing it play out a little bit now in Russia with Putin. The ability for people to believe and articulate a completely different truth from each other. I'm afraid it's a sort of perennial human phenomenon. In autocracy, and we see it in our Western culture. I mean, all the conspiracy theory stuff, and people seriously believing that we're all being poisoned and brainwashed and various things. There's something in the human brain that finds it quite easy to believe and articulate strange things.
Yes, well, you brought us very nicely up to the present there, Ben. There is another question here, perhaps. No,
hello. My daughter has just started reading modern languages. She's chosen Exeter.
Excellent.
Which is no doubt because of the excellent parliamentary representation that
not for much longer.
I know so little of the situation there, but I'm wondering whether your time there will inform your parliamentary career and your hopes for this country, and I would just love to know some of those.
Yes, I mean, my answer to that is going to be tinged with an element of sadness, because yes, it definitely informed my thinking on the kind of fundamental human desire and thirst for autonomy and freedom and democracy. And that was a very optimistic time, that post-1997 time. It also, kind of strengthened my view that collective security was vital against hostile autocratic powers that don't share our values. And attached to that, very fundamentally, the positive and important role of the European Union in helping this process proceed and end peacefully, and indeed the huge enlargement of the European Union that followed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, and the fact that all of these other countries in Europe that shared our values and wanted some of what we've got, thought the European Union was an essential way of achieving that, and at that very time, Britain decides to walk away, and that will probably be kind of my abiding sadness, really. I think tragic historical mistake for our country, and one that I'm confident will, in time, be revisited. but not as quickly as I would like. And in the meantime, we have to kind of keep living with the consequences and the fallout. So yes, I mean it's you know, if you told me in the euphoria in the aftermath of the Berlin Wall and EU enlargement that we'd be where we are now, I really wouldn't have, you know, believed you. But here we are. So it's up to the next generation to sort that out.
That's true. Over to the young ones. Yeah. Well, here we are now, as you've just said, and thank you all very much for coming this evening, both live here in St George's and to the online audience as well. It only remains for me to say thank you very much to Ben and to invite everyone here present, although not online, for a glass of wine and a piece of cake at the back of the church now, when perhaps we'll be able to continue asking Ben some questions and about his time in Berlin and as a politician. So thank you very much for being with us.